Hello, time for class. Um, this is Kentucky history, and we're going to open with prayer. Father, thank you for the Commonwealth, the way you have blessed us here and caused your grace to be so abundant. Ask that you would help us to learn to love her more fully and serve her for the kingdom's sake in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, we are moving on to the Civil War. We're going to talk about it for probably 3 weeks. We'll get into the more information about the Civil War itself in the book next week. But this week in this video, I want to start by giving some background. Now remember, we're going to talk about the Civil War in Kentucky. We're not going to talk about the whole Civil War, but what went on in Kentucky. Next year, with Mr. Grissom, you'll study the Civil War in U.S. history. And it's a massive war. It touched almost every person in the United States. In the year 2012, there was a popular Civil War bibliography printed, and it had the title of 60,000 books that had been written to that point about the Civil War, because it touched every area so much that a book could be written about what it did to the economy, what it did to women, what it did to the geography, what it did to the government. It changed everything. And so it is probably the defining event. Some people might say that the Revolutionary War was more defining, but as far as after we became a nation, the one event that stands out is the Civil War. So we're going to limit our study to the war in Kentucky. We're not even going to talk that much about Kentuckians who fought in other places. We'll mention Fort Sumter. Of course, we'll mention Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln, both born in Kentucky. And we'll talk about Generals Lee and Grant, the primary general in the North and the South. Or I should say the South and the North. But that's about all we're going to have time for in the big Civil War to mention those things. And also, we're not really going to have time to go into a lot of details on even the small battles in Kentucky. We will watch a video on the Battle of Perryville and talk about that in class. But before we get to the material on the Civil War in the book and talk about it, the Civil War proper, I want to talk about the causes of the Civil War. Another thing that I think would be important, and now we're kind of moving away from the stories, the interesting things of the pioneers, and really I want you to begin to think more about the ideas that are shaping Kentucky. Certainly when we talk about these causes of the Civil War, those are ideas. Number two, we'll want to think about Kentucky's political positions throughout the war. Because of these different ideas, they take different positions politically. We were opposed to the war, and we didn't want to secede from the other states. We were a slave state. But as the reality of the war ground ahead, Kentucky became more and more aligned politically as a southern state. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about why. And the other thing I think that I want to emphasize is the fact that we, as much as any state, and more than most, we were divided. The number of men who fought for the South and the North really demonstrates the division in our state, brother against brother, father against son. And so in this video, we're going to talk about the causes of the war. Remember I said that we were going to talk about the war in Kentucky. And so these steps leading up to the war have very much to do with the state of Kentucky, most specifically because our favorite son, Henry Clay, was very involved in the compromises and the negotiations that went on between the North and South to put the war off. There's two causes of the Civil War we're going to talk about, but two of them loom largest. Most notable is the issue of slavery. We will talk about that in more detail, slavery itself, but what we're going to talk about in this video is the attitude of the North, the South, and Kentucky towards slavery. And then the second thing is the question of states' rights. So number one, most notable, the issue of slavery. But almost, and maybe as much, as significant, is the question of states' rights. So when the Constitution was adopted in 1791 or 1792, I think, there was already a big divide in the country over slavery. Many original slaves had been brought into the northern seaports, and at one time, 1 out of every 5 citizens in New York was actually a slave. 1 out of every 5 people was a slave. However, after the Revolution, the North began selling their slaves down south, and by 1840, most northern states had outlawed slavery. There were always people in the North who were opposed to slavery, but there were also many people in the South opposed to slavery. There were always people in the North who were pro-slavery, and of course in the South, many people were pro-slavery. The Founding Fathers were aware of this divide in the country, but they didn't fully address it in the Constitution. When they framed the Constitution, they mentioned, not by name, but they mentioned people who were slaves as people who were indentured, or people who, I believe, bound to labor is what they said. And they didn't face it. And slavery did not end in the South until the Emancipation Proclamation. But that did not end slavery in America. There were still states that had slaves. It only became illegal throughout the whole country when Congress passed the 13th Amendment, January 31st, 1865. And so what that amendment says is this: Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. In Section 2, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. That's 3 things. 1, the shift of slavery from all over America to out of the North into the South. Number 2, there were always people, North and South, pro and con slavery, but it got concentrated in the South. And then number 3, this problem was here at the very founding of our nation. And the Founding Fathers knew that it needed to be dealt with, but they didn't feel as though that they could take a strong stand as they were trying to get the Constitution adopted. So they put it off for later generations to deal with it. And it did not end completely until the 13th Amendment, which was after the Civil War. Okay, so like I said, there's 2 primary causes, slavery and states' rights. I'm going to talk about states' rights first because it appears first in our text. And then when we get around to talking about slavery, we're going to talk about how the balance of states who were pro and con slavery was a big part of what led to the Civil War. So I'm going to talk about states' rights first because that appears first in our text. And so on page 58 of your text. You can open there if you want to. And I'm just going to read this. We have learned that the opposition of Kentuckians to federal government had its origin in their own trials. For a large majority of the people believed that the central government might have put an end to those if it had attempted to do so. But there were also clauses in the Constitution of the United States to which they were directly opposed. Many objected to the policy of the Federalists by whom the Constitution was framed because they believed it tended toward a monarchical rather than a republican form of government. In other words, the Constitution gave more power to someone who was kind of like a king rather than a government that was just representative of the people. The text goes on to say, we have noticed Kentucky's isolated situation and her long, single-handed struggle for existence. Naturally, her people were watchful for their state's rights and liberties. But we learned also that in the times of greatest temptation, her people stood true to the Union. This fact indicates loyalty and sagacity and calls for the highest admiration. In short, Kentucky was concerned that the Constitution may have given too much power to the federal government. However, in the times of greatest temptation when they would think about leaving, they chose to remain true to the Union, which was a good choice. So we see the Kentuckians were skeptical of a strong federal government. They wanted each state to have more power for themselves and for the federal government to have limited power, which actually the 10th Amendment does describe how limited the power of the government is. All right, so this is why we see Kentuckians react so strongly to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were passed in 1798. You'll remember, we talked about the Alien and Sedition Acts, that they gave the power to the president to, number one, remove aliens from United States soil for any reason that he chose, and also to be able to expel anyone who spoke against the against the government. The Sedition Act says basically it permitted the deportation, fine, or imprisonment of anyone deemed a threat or publishing false, scandalous, or malicious writing against the government of the United States. So these two acts gave the power to the president that Kentuckians didn't believe that he should have. One, you could get rid of opponents by kicking them out. Two, if anyone spoke against you, you could call that seditious against the government and kick them out. And so you could slowly whittle the number of people down, the citizenry down, to where only the people that supported you remained. And so they blew up because they thought this was an overreach of power, and they thought they especially defied the First Amendment, which gave us the right to free speech. So at this point, I want you to stop this video, and I want you to go to the first link that I've sent you. It's another video that explains the Kentucky resolutions. I want you to understand what was going on there. So the video is about 7 minutes. It talks about some other things. So you have to skip to minute number 4 and begin at minute number 4 and listen to the rest of this. That'll only be about 3 minutes, and then come back and we'll talk about it. But before you listen to the video, I'm going to ask you to do this. Get your textbook and read about the Kentucky resolutions in page 61 and 62, and then listen to the video, and then come back. Okay, I'm guessing that you've read the 2 pages in the text, you've listened to the video, you're back. So, Kentuckians believe that the Alien and Sedition Acts gave too much power to the federal government. Federal government, of course, is the government that's in Washington, D.C. So the question then becomes, if a state thinks a law passed by the federal government, again, the government in Washington, D.C., if it's unconstitutional, if it's beyond what we expect them to be able to do according to the Constitution, does that state have the right to nullify that law for their state? In other words, with the Alien Sedition Acts, could we as Kentuckians have said, hey, look, you don't have that kind of authority in our state. We did not agree to a constitution that gave you that power. It was the right to nullify. This issue is known as the issue of states' rights. When things finally come to a head 60 years later in 1861, this is the contention. South Carolina wanted to secede, that is, leave the United States. 6 other states followed, and Abraham Lincoln did not believe that they had the right to do this. So he immediately began to take steps that led to the confrontation at Fort Sumter. And so the whole idea that the federal government can't take more power than it should, and a state's right to nullify anything that federal government might do contrary to the Constitution, and finally the right to even leave the Union if that state believes that they are not living up to the legal standards of the Constitution, was a big part of why southern states begin to secede from the North. States' rights, the right of a state to exert its own power in areas that are not legally constituted to the federal government. Okay, states' rights. The more obvious cause we mentioned earlier is the disagreement over slavery. As a whole, the northern free states opposed slavery. The agricultural South depended on slavery for their economy. The disagreement began with the earliest colonists. Some were opposed to it from the beginning. And there's 2 events, though, that are closely connected to Kentucky as we get into the history that are very, very closely connected to Kentucky, because Henry Clay, our senator, was the person most responsible for bartering compromises. So the North basically was free, the South was basically slave, and they were always in contention, trying to figure out how to deal with this disagreement. The North, of course, wanted the South to free their slaves. The South felt like they were dependent on them and wanted to hang on to them. And now, we're not going to talk about the morality of slavery in this video. We will come back and we will talk about that in a couple of weeks. But all we're talking about now is, yes, the North believed one thing, the South had another position, and they were trying to find out how to forge ahead. Well, from when Kentucky became a state in 1792 until the Civil War, there are 3 or 4 major events, major laws that were passed that dealt with this struggle. The first one that I want you to consider was the Missouri Compromise. The second one that I would want you to look at is the Compromise of 1850. Now, you're going to watch a short video on each of these compromises. But what I want to point out is that there was always a strong contention over slavery. You can see how the nation struggled to live in this tension as you see how they worked through these different compromises. And here's what happened. You had your northern free states, your southern slave states. As new land was added to the original states, then the North and the South would have big arguments over whether they could be admitted as free or admitted as slaves. And these two compromises that Henry Clay was the architect of really kept us from going to war. But it is also the path that ultimately ends to war, leads to war. So the Missouri Compromise was after Thomas Jefferson, as president, purchased the Louisiana Territory. I believe he got it all for $60,000. I'm not sure. But the Missouri Compromise was a compromise about how to deal with the land that we got from the Louisiana Territory. Well, 30 years later, after the Mexican War, remember we talked about the Mexican War, there was a new compromise that was needed because there was territory that was ceded to the United States by Mexico. Ultimately, I think that became New Mexico, Nevada, and California. But both of these compromises were put together by Henry Clay, our senator, and it really did bring some kind of peace for a period of time. So the Missouri Compromise is mentioned briefly in your text on page 76. In just a minute, I'm going to have you stop this video and watch a video on the Missouri Compromise. Then after that, though, I want you to go in your book on page 86 and 87 and read about the Compromise of 1850, also called the Omnibus Bill. And then there will be a video about the Compromise of 1850. So after you watch these two videos, you should understand how the whole United States grappled with this division between the North and the South, this differing positions, and how Henry Clay really worked to keep it in balance. He didn't really work to end slavery. His position was that we should gradually end slavery. It was called a gradual emancipation, which meant they would be emancipated through different years, depending on the age of the slave and other contributing factors. So he didn't really work at immediately freeing slaves. What he worked at was keeping the peace in the United States until we could work through and find that means by which all slaves would be free. So you're going to listen to the video on the Missouri Compromise. After that, you're going to read page 86 and 87, and then watch the video labeled Compromise of 1850. Okay, great. Thank you, and then keep reading. Do your journals, and we will talk about the material that's in the book about the Civil War. We'll talk about Lincoln, Jeff Davis, and the original division of Kentucky. Our government divided. Our standing militias. One went north and one went south. And we'll talk about how Kentucky dealt with this battle or this war that really split our state. So God bless you, and God bless our great Commonwealth.